Thanks to you at home for joining us this next hour. I want to tell you right up front here that on the interview tonight, which is happening a little later on this hour, we've got a really big deal guest here for the interview. The Malaysian Airlines plane that went missing had 3 American citizens on board. 2 of them were little kids, toddlers. One of them is a 50-year-old IBM executive named Philip Wood. Philip Wood is one of the people on that missing plane, and his partner, his girlfriend, is going to be joining us live this hour. That is the interview tonight, and I want to make sure that you know that that is coming up this hour. It's a big deal tonight that we get to speak to her, so I hope you will be here for that. But we start tonight in Mayflower, Arkansas. It was almost a year ago. It was last March 29th when this happened. When an ExxonMobil pipeline burst under the ground in Mayflower, Arkansas. Now, the people who lived in that town had no idea they were living on top of an oil pipeline, but they were. And when it burst, it suddenly became very, very, very clear how much of a mess they were in. That massive spill caused Exxon to shut down the whole length of its Pegasus pipeline, which runs not just through Arkansas, it runs all the way from Illinois, all the way down into the Gulf Coast, all the way down to Texas. But that spill more than just shut down Mayflower, Arkansas. Exxon ended up just buying out some of the people who lived there in the spill zone, just buying their houses and tearing them down. And Exxon then embarked on and paid for what ended up being a solid year of dirty, toxic cleanup work in Mayflower, Arkansas. Well, as of this weekend, according to the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, ExxonMobil has now declared that they are done, all taken care of. They have completed the cleanup of contaminated soil stemming from that burst pipeline last year. Seems like part of the reason they want to declare the cleanup is over is because they want to open their pipeline up again. They've already put in a formal request to at least restart the 200 miles of it that runs through Texas. But, you know, it's awkward for them. Texas is right next to Arkansas, and this is what Exxon did to Arkansas with that pipeline. So you can understand it's a rather sensitive matter. Even as ExxonMobil, though, is saying that they are done with their environmental cleanup in Arkansas, the company does admit that there may be some trailing ends in that town. The company is saying now that even though it would mostly like to wrap up what they're doing, they're still planning to come around once a week or so to monitor whether there is still an oil sheen on what used to be an awesome fishing lake nearby called Lake Conway. They say they'll come by once a week or so to see if there's an oil sheen on that lake, and if so, they promise to skim it off. They also say they will come by within 48 hours after it rains to scoop more of the oil off the lake after it presumably washes into the lake from the nearby soil and trees. They've also promised to leave trails of boom around the waterways in Mayflower, Arkansas. Ah, yes, boom, the oil industry's most flaccid and pivotal reminder of how they have invested basically nothing in improving the technology to clean up oil spills, even as they, as an industry, have invested billions and billions and billions in learning how to drill more oil. Getting it out of the ground, no expense spared. Cleaning it up, we're still using technology that we had in the 60s. ExxonMobil in Mayflower, Arkansas says they will leave some boom laying around. They say they'll leave it in the water, and they promise to come by every 3 months to pick up that boom once it is sullied with oil. That's their leaving plan. That's what Mayflower, Arkansas can expect from ExxonMobil. And, you know, maybe this is the industry standard when something like this happens. Maybe this is the best that Exxon can do. But it is hard not to expect more from the richest company in the history of companies, from a company as massive and as powerful and as rich as Exxon. Exxon holds the all-time record in the United States for quarterly profits for a corporation, ever. To achieve that record, they had to beat out themselves, since Exxon also held the previous record for the most profitable corporation in any one quarter ever. Last year, Exxon's $45 billion profit, $45 billion take home. Last year, Exxon's $45 billion in profit ranked it number 2 on the Fortune 500 list of the most profitable U.S. companies. And so that $45 billion profit last year represents a down year for Exxon. Steve Call's really excellent book about Exxon, which is called Private Empire, describes a company that is so big and so rich that it has adopted an internal corporate philosophy that's not just global in outlook. It's not just transnational. It's basically post-national. Internally, the ExxonMobil ethos, is that governments come and go. Countries come and go. But Exxon needs to think bigger than that, because Exxon will survive even when countries and governments don't. hence private empire. You'd never know it from the way they are treating little Mayflower, Arkansas right now, the way they are walking away from that disaster in that little town, just leaving some boom behind that they plan to check quarterly. But ExxonMobil is absolutely massive in corporate terms. They are historically huge, but they are not the hugest. Last year, ExxonMobil was surpassed as the world's largest oil company by these guys, Rosneft. Right before the Olympics, you might remember that Russian President Vladimir Putin put on kind of a show of letting some dissidents and political prisoners out of prison ahead of the Olympics. Remember that? He released 2 imprisoned members of the band Pussy Riot, who'd been in jail for almost 2 years. The other really high-profile political prisoner who he released right ahead of the Olympics was this man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was once Russia's richest man. When he was still free, he decided to use his economic power to fund and help lead an opposition effort against Vladimir Putin and his seemingly permanent reign in Russia. Well, the payback for that was that Vladimir Putin not only had him jailed for over a decade before he released him just before the Olympics and this pre-Olympics amnesty, but Putin and the Russian government also seized the assets of Mr. Khodorkovsky's company, seized the assets of Yukos Oil. That's the company that had made Mikhail Khodorkovsky so rich. So they jailed the guy, they took his company, and they made the assets of his company part of Rosneft. And it is by gobbling up other companies and trading for other companies' assets that Rosneft is the biggest now in the world. They have surpassed ExxonMobil to become the largest oil company on the globe. And if it is hard to imagine a company even bigger than ExxonMobil, imagine a new joint venture between the company that is even bigger than ExxonMobil and ExxonMobil. The 2 largest oil companies in the world, larger than anything ever before seen in the history of capitalism, are now doing a big joint venture together. They're due to start drilling any minute now. Their first joint well in the Arctic is tick, 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 due to start this year, sometime soon. This joint venture will have them building a natural gas export terminal in Russia's Far East. They'll be drilling a new deep water well in the Black Sea. They'll be fracking shale fields in Siberia. And they're going to be drilling oil in an area of the Arctic that is larger than the size of Texas. That deal basically between the mother of all oil companies and the mother of all oil companies, that deal was signed at Vladimir Putin's house. Literally. At his vacation home in Sochi, that's where they signed the deal in 2011. Last year, the CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson, he went to St. Petersburg in Russia so Vladimir Putin could bestow upon him this medal. It's called the Order of Friendship. Russia's been giving out this medal since 1994. Sometimes they give it to Russian citizens, but more often they give it to foreigners who Russia sees as having made the world better for Russia, essentially. This medal, as I said, has existed since 1994. Before that, it also existed under a different name. It was called the Order of Friendship of Peoples instead of just the Order of Friendship. Under the Soviet Union, they called it the Order of Friendship of Peoples. And you can see they sort of kept the basic shape. Star with a little circle inside it, a little stripy ribbon. They did drop the hammer and sickle, though. On the new one, tweaked the name very slightly, but it's basically the same deal. At the ExxonMobil website, the official bio for Rex Tillerson, the Exxon CEO, lists proudly that he has been awarded the Order of Friendship by Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation. Today, the European Union announced individual targeted sanctions against 21 people in Russia and in Crimea who the EU says were instrumental in trying to break Crimea off from the nation of Ukraine and make it part of Russia instead. Those 21 individuals will be banned from travel to any European Union country, and any assets they have in any European Union country as of today are frozen. That list is the product of negotiations by the various countries in the European Union. All their foreign ministers had to agree. But the United States also announced sanctions today. Because of U.S. law, we do it differently. The decision on American sanctions, in our case, was just made by President Obama. He didn't have to consult with Congress or anybody else. He could just make the decision as an executive action. And in his executive action today, the United States named 7 Russian officials and 4 Crimean officials, so 11 people altogether. They will also be subject to a visa ban from the United States, which means, like those EU sanctions, these people on the U.S. list will not be allowed to travel to the United States. Also, an asset freeze. Any assets they have in the United States States, as of today, are frozen. How serious is this as an economic move today? How tough are these sanctions? For what it's worth, stock markets around the world went up today upon the announcement of those sanctions. They went up, especially in Russia, which is not a sign that anybody thinks Russia just got hurt or that this is any serious economic punishment. On the sunny side, though, this does mean that there is plenty of room to escalate sanctions, right? If the European Union and the United States do want to make the sanctions hurt more, if they really do want them to hurt enough to dissuade Russia from the course that it's on in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, there's a lot more that they can do. There's room to move. They could add more people to the list. The European list right now is 21 people. The American list is 11 people. There are 4 people who are on both lists who they overlap. They're sanctioned by both the European Union and the U.S. So those lists could expand. There could start to be more overlap between those 2 lists, which would make things harder for the people that are on them. It would also not be unprecedented to expand the sanctions list by adding not just those individuals or more individuals, but also their entire families. That has been done before. It not only makes the sanctions wider ranging, it also stops one of the easiest ways that people can use their own family members to evade those personal sanctions. President Obama also announced today that he signed an executive order giving himself the authorization to sanction businesses. Specifically, he mentioned people involved in the Russian arms trade. It would sharply increase the bite of sanctions to essentially stop the international economic activity of individual Russian businessmen and businesswomen and Russian companies operating abroad. In the years of ratcheting up sanctions against Iran, what ended up being the most devastating escalation of those sanctions was when those sanctions went after Iranian banks. They essentially cut off all Iranian banks from being able to do any international transactions. That isolated Iran's economy from the world in a way that was absolutely crippling, and it happened almost immediately. That's not just any other kind of sanction. That's kind of an economic death blow. And that is, in theory at least, on the menu of choices for the Europeans and for the United States. Those kind of things work best if you coordinate. I mean, they could do that to Russian banks. It would take a lot of international coordination. It would take a lot of diplomacy. It would take a lot of determination. But it would basically, in one blow, backhand Russia about 40 years into the past in terms of its economy. And then there's also the matter of not just Russian companies and Russian banks, but American companies and European companies. It is illegal for U.S. companies to do business in Iran right now, except in very limited circumstances. As the U.S. and the world look at their menu of options for trying to stuff Russia back in its box, essentially, to stop Russia from what looks like an expansionist march west toward NATO, should it be legal for European countries, for American countries, to keep doing business inside Russia? Companies like Boeing and Ford and Pepsi have huge stakes inside Russia, including lots of Americans working for those American companies inside Russia. But you know what? Nobody has anything like Exxon. If you really wanted to make Vladimir Putin take notice, the thing you would probably want to rattle first is that largest oil deal in the history of oil deals, which was literally signed in his living room. You want to get to something he cares about? He cares about that. Nobody expects an actual shooting war between the West and Russia over their behavior right now. No matter how much Senator John McCain might want one, nobody expects one. But an economic war started today. The U.S. and the EU fired the first economic shots today. And Russia is apparently firing back by saying it, too, might sanction and freeze Russian assets for a number of U.S. and European officials. There's some reporting today that that could happen tomorrow, that Russia will announce its own sanctions against U.S. officials. How far and how fast is this war going to escalate? And ultimately, how far can an economic war escalate before it eventually starts to get very close to being a shooting war? Joining us now is Michael McFaul. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's currently a professor of political science at Stanford University. Professor McFaul, thank you very much for being with us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Let me ask you about that range of sanctions, range of economic options that I just laid out there. Do you think that that is the actual realm of what's possible? Is that the menu of options that American and European officials could consider?
Yeah, I think you laid it out quite eloquently, frankly. I was wondering what I could add. To say a few things, I think that you rightly said these were the first shots, right? It's clear to me that the Europeans and the Obama administration are preparing for further sanctions should there be further actions by President Putin. It was clear as day that President Obama, in signing this new executive order, was giving himself more authority to go after those not just for their behavior related directly to Crimea, but to their standing, that is, to their position in the government and to their position in the economy. And I think they're holding those now. But if Russia does annex Crimea and go forward with that, I think you'll see further sanctions.
This may be a naive question, but it struck me today that the ousted president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was on the list, but President Putin is not, although there are other high-ranking Russian officials. Why was that?
I don't know exactly. My guess is, having participated in previous sanctions debate when I used to work for the government, is that the president wants to be able to meet with President Putin. He wants to be able to deal with him in a direct way on a range of issues, and therefore there are certain categories of people that will not appear on the list. However, you alluded to, I think, what will be the critical decision for the Europeans and the United States, which is, do they go after economic actors, individuals that run these large corporations, including Rosneft, as you mentioned just earlier. That's run by somebody very close to Vladimir Putin. Igor Sechin is his name. And that would be a dramatic move. That would be a very dramatic move to go after that joint venture.
When American economic interests are involved, and I talk about Exxon as an American economic interest, I guess, in a technical sense. They're headquartered in Irving, Texas, so technically they're an American company, although I think they think of themselves more as a global entity. How does that manifest inside the U.S. government when decisions are made for diplomatic or security or political reasons in terms of our relations with other countries, and it potentially has an impact economically on American businesses? How do they make themselves known? How do they lobby on international issues like this? I'm just trying to think what Exxon is doing right now, worrying over the prospect of sanctions.
Well, of course, I don't know if the technical term is lobbying, but I have no doubt that they are reaching out to government officials in the executive branch, in Congress. I worked with ExxonMobil very closely as the U.S. ambassador to Russia. I know all their people. In fact, I was just staying in the hotel in Sochi with the presidential delegation, and we just happened to be in the same hotel with Rosneft and ExxonMobil. So we saw them at the bar just a couple weeks ago. They, of course, are making their argument. It's clear what they're saying, that, look, yes, this is a problem, but don't mess with the American economy, don't mess with the European economy, and that's what these sanctions will do. So that's their argument on one side. They have certain people that will listen to that. And on the other side, within the government, are people saying there has to be a real price for this outrageous behavior. I have no doubt that that's exactly the debate happening at the White House right now.
I'll tell you one other thing that I have read today and that I've heard today, people talking about this, that makes no sense to me, is the great fear that Russia could strike back economically in a way that would hurt the world as much as the world could help Russia. I mean, Russia is a big country. It doesn't have a giant economy when it comes to contrasting it with, sort of, say, the United States or China or some of the other major economies in the world. It's hard for me to imagine that in an economic war, there's much that Russia could do to us. It seems like most of the things that they could do would be to hurt the countries they're already hurting with the kind of aggression they're showing on the ground. Is that naive?
I think it's basically right, because there's an interdependence there, right? If Russia, for instance, shuts off the gas to Europe, that hurts the revenues of the Russian government. It's a petro state, let's be clear. They depend on that. But there's a difference between capacity and will, right? And if you're very motivated and you answer to nobody and you don't answer to your citizens, as President Putin doesn't right now, he may be more motivated to take the economic hits in this tit-for-tat escalation. That's the difference. Whereas Western leaders have to listen to ExxonMobil, they have to listen to their constituents, they have to listen to shareholders, they have to listen to those whose pensions will be affected by economic sanctions, and that is a more complicated game in a democratic political system.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, thank you very much for helping us understand this. It's really invaluable to have you here. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
All right. There remains mainly Total mystery about the missing Malaysia Airlines 777. A tiny bit of information today and a ton of wild speculation. Coming up, we've got the facts in evidence as distinguished from the speculation, but also a very special guest tonight, an American woman in Beijing whose loved one, whose boyfriend, is missing on that airplane. That's the interview tonight, and that's coming up. Stay with us.